If I would ask you the question to tell me which talent gives me the most damage on my sniper, and I would let you choose between competent and elevated, you would probably give me either one of two answers. You would either tell me that competent is stronger because I'll be able to use that more often in more situations, or you will tell me that they're both pretty much the same. It's both 10%. It just depends on your build, on the situation, on your playstyle, all that stuff, right? That is what you would give me as an answer, right? Well, if that's the case, I have to say that in both cases, unfortunately, you're wrong. You don't believe me? Alright, let's take a look at this in-game comparison. I just crafted this shitty sniper, and my plan is to hit as hard as I can on this unsuspecting player. So before I shoot, I'm going to use Tactical Advance, Booster Shot, and the Mobile Cover to maximize my damage. The thing is that I'm going to do this twice. The first time, I'm going to have Competent as my weapon talent, and the second time, I'm going to have Elevated. Of course, both of those talents will be active when I shoot, but other than that, this build, the weapon, the guy that I'm shooting at, they are all identical. So how do you think this is gonna go down? Well, on paper, both buffs give me a 10% damage boost. So they should be pretty much the same. However, with Competent, I'm hitting for 178,000 damage. While with Elevated, I'm hitting for 184,000 damage. Sure, that's not that big of a difference, but it can be enough to matter. So how is this possible? I just said that both talents give me a 10% damage bonus when used, so why are the damage results different from each other? Well, that is because the damage that you get from Competent is additive, and the damage that you get from Elevated is multiplicative, and that is what this video is going to be about. I want to show you the differences between additive damage and multiplicative damage, and let you know how it works in terms of stacking buffs in the division. And then of course also give you a full list of what is what and what are the best buffs in the game as a result of all of this, so you can maybe just improve your build a little bit here and there and maximize your damage. So yeah, that's what we're gonna do today. Let's begin. When we're talking about just a single additive versus a single multiplicative buff, there isn't really any difference between the two. Whether you simply add 10% damage to your weapon the additive way or the multiplicative way, the results will be exactly the same. The only difference between the two is the way that you calculate it. With the additive way, we simply took an extra step by showing in our formula that we added the 10% damage, the 0.10, to the base damage, the 1. While in the multiplicative way, with the multiplicative formula, we don't really see that back. We just see that the number is increased by 1.10, or in other words, 10%. If you want to be accurate in math class and you want to be smart, you can really use either. Honestly, it does not matter. But when a developer has to code a game, he needs to write something in those code lines, and at that point, he is going to have to decide which one to pick, and it just so happens to be that in the division, we have a mixture between these two. A lot of buffs in the game are coded to be calculated in the additive way, and a lot of other buffs are calculated in the multiplicative way. Why the developers went with additive or multiplicative for certain buffs? I don't know, they just did. For example, let's take this instance where the player stacks Competent with his booster shot. Both of these are calculated in the additive way, and thus the result is that we have the 10% damage and the 15% damage being added together to the base damage, which gives us a total of 25% extra damage, and thus changing our bullet damage from 100,000 to 125,000. Makes sense, right? But now, for our second example, instead of using Booster Shot and Competent, we're going to be using the 10% out of cover damage bonus from the Banshee 3-piece and the 15% extra damage from the Prepared Weapon talent. Both of these bonuses are calculated in a multiplicative way in the division, and thus we will be using the multiplicative formula. So instead of adding the bonuses together and then multiplying the base damage, we're now also going to multiply these bonuses with each other. That's where the term multiplicative comes from. So that is 100,000 times 1.1, the Banshee out of cover damage, times 1.15, the prepared damage, which gives us not 125,000, but 126,500. This difference, it is small. It is very small, but it's only a very simple example with relatively very small buffs. If we stack more buffs, and we definitely can without going to extreme examples, the difference will be quite big, as for example, both the player's critical hits and his headshots are also calculated in this formula, and they're also calculated in a multiplicative way after the base damage. We'll get back to headshots and crits soon in the video, but for now you just gotta remember that the more you can increase that base damage, the harder your crits and headshots are gonna hit for. And the best way to increase your base damage is with those multiplicative buffs. For example, let's say that your assault rifle does 5,000 damage to other players. You have 100% headshot damage, you have 70% critical hit damage, you have 10% damage from the pulse, 15% damage from the booster shot, you got 16% damage from the skill gloves, and let's say that you have 2 damage talents on your weapons. In this case, you have Unforgiving, which gives you another 10% damage boost because you have 2 health bars left, and then you also have Competent, which is another 10%. Now everything here, apart from the headshot damage and the critical hit damage, is additive in the Division. But now you meet someone in the Dark Zone that has an identical build to yours. Everything exactly the same. 100% headshot damage, 70% crit, etc, etc, etc. The only difference between you and him is that instead of Competent, this guy is using Responsive. Now Responsive is also just like Competent 10% damage, but the difference is that Responsive is actually calculated multiplicative. Now obviously, we've been far enough in the video for you to know that there's going to be a difference between the two. But how big do you think that difference is actually going to be? First up, let's calculate your build, the one with Competent, so we have to do everything additive. We have 5000 plus the pulse, plus the booster, plus the skill gloves, plus Unforgiving, and then plus Competent. And then at the very end, we have to calculate the headshot damage plus the crit damage in the multiplicative way. Again, we'll get into more detail with the headshots and the crits later in the video. Just focus on Competent for now. If we put this in a formula, we end up with 21,735 damage per bullet. That's not too bad, that's definitely something right there, but is it going to be enough to melt your opponent down? Let's find out. Let's replace Competent and replace it with Responsive. And Responsive is multiplicative, so we have the base damage, plus the pulse, the booster, the skills, we have Unforgiving, we all calculate these additive. But then at the very end, instead of adding another 10% as Competent, we're going to be using Responsive, which will add multiplicative. So we just multiply it by 1.10. And then after that, we add the headshot damage and the crit damage. And that gives us a per bullet damage of 22,423. That's right there, that's about a 700 per bullet damage increase. And we only swapped out one talent that on paper seemed to be just as powerful. That's the thing here. We're getting small increases that on paper shouldn't give us an increase at all. And of course you could say to just get both Competent and Responsive on your weapon for the most damage possible. And sure, you can do that, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm trying to show you that while both of these talents tell the player that you get 10% more damage, in reality, when they're both active, Responsive will almost always be stronger. And the more additional buffs you have to go with that, the bigger that difference gets. Again, this is just an example where we only swapped out one talent. So it seems that when we're trying to get the most damage out of our weapons, someone would want to get as many multiplicative damage bonuses as possible as opposed to additive damage bonuses, right? And that's correct. So how do we know which damage bonuses in the Division are additive and which ones are multiplicative? And that's the thing. You don't really know. The game does not tell you. The only way to find out is by actually testing everything in the game and then reverse calculating the damage numbers that you're seeing. But hey, you probably already guessed it. That's why you have me. That's why we have this video, so I can do all the heavy lifting for you. By far, the most damage buffs in the game are additive. Every single skill buff, for example the pulse, the booster shot, the 10% that you get from the mobile cover, even the damage from the tech link, most of the gear set damage buffs such as the striker stacks, the damage from the skill gloves, the predator, the alpha, lone star, the damage from the final measure 6Ps, reckless, tenacious, bliss holster stacks, stack advance, competent, unforgiving, I can keep going. I've got a whole watch list of buffs that are additive and thus may not seem as strong as they appear to be on paper. So instead of talking about the additive bonuses, instead of writing down every single additive bonus in the game, let's instead look at which damage boosts are multiplicative, because those are ultimately going to be the things that you want to chase. First and foremost, let's finally talk about headshot damage and crit damage to make sure that everybody is on the same page here. Both headshot damage and critical hit damage are multiplicative bonuses added at the very end of the formula. This makes both of those very, very strong. However, when you add headshot damage together with critical hit damage, they will not multiply off of each other, but instead they will add up together in the additive way. This means that individually, headshots are still very strong, and individually, critical hits are also very strong. But if you then get a critical hit headshot, it doesn't give you any extra bonus. It wasn't always like this. When the Division just came out, critical hits used to also multiply off of headshots, but this wasn't really a good thing because it also forced the NPCs into having ridiculously high health pools to oppose a challenge and caused too much inconsistency with the per bullet damage for PvP. So with patch 1.4 they changed it to how it currently works. There is still one pitfall with the headshot damage though, which I did not really talk about in my formula because I thought it was going to be too confusing. but it is that in PvP, headshot damage goes through a 0.8 multiplier. So let's say that you have 100% headshot damage on your character, and you land a headshot, that would actually only result in an 80% multiplicative buff to your damage. Critical hits, on the other hand, they still apply for the full 100%, which is also why Deadeye is always going to be a bit stronger than any headshot-orientated sniper build can ever be. Next up, we have these 3 weapon talents: Responsive, Prepared, and Elevated. These 3 weapon talents in the game are also calculated in a multiplicative way. Most people probably know about Responsive. Pretty much everybody that runs with an assault rifle or an SMG or a shotgun has Responsive on their weapon, and Prepared is just too good not to take on any sniper rifle related build, including Deadeye. Elevated is a little bit more difficult to proc, but I know that there are plenty of people running around with this as well, and I can tell you that if you combine Elevated with Prepared on your Deadeye sniper consistently, you'll be ending up with a disgusting amount of damage because you don't have 1, but you've got 2 multiplicative damage bonuses on your sniper as a baseline. The special talent that comes with the MDR, Distracted, is also multiplicative, so when you have a target with a status effect, it actually starts to hit a lot harder, and the Firecrest 15% damage is also multiplicative, so when you combine these two, run a Firecrest build with the MDR and manage to set people on fire, you'll start to see your damage skyrocket up there. As I've also mentioned already in this video, the out of cover damage bonus from the Banshee 3-piece is also calculated in a multiplicative way, and surprisingly enough, the 4-piece damage bonus, the 10% extra damage versus rogues, is also multiplicative. But it doesn't stop there. You know that special talent that Banshee has, which gives you another 10% damage bonus when you die to a rogue for like 10 minutes? That in itself is another separate buff, and that buff too is also multiplicative, and it doesn't stack in an additive way with the 10% damage to rogue players as a base. This means that if you run the 4-piece Banshee and you get killed by a rogue player, you will not have 1, you will not have 2, but you will have 3 10% multiplicative damage boosts as a starting point. You're going to be absolutely melting people down. Banshee is low-key the best set for killing rogues in the DZ. As it should be actually, but I didn't know it was this strong. The out of cover damage on the LMG is also multiplicative, but to my surprise again, it actually stacks in an additive way with the out of cover damage on Banshee. What this means is that when you combine these two, you put them together, you run 4 Banshee with an LMG, it's not actually going to be as strong as people think it is, because you don't get any added value out of it that you otherwise wouldn't have had. It's just as effective to run Banshee with an assault rifle or to run an LMG with any other gear set. It gives you just as much value. Interestingly enough, damage to elites and enemy armor damage are also both multiplicative, meaning that if you get about 50% enemy armor damage and 50% damage to elites on your build, you will literally have over double the damage output versus elite NPCs and named bosses. That's another reason why assault rifles are also pretty much the strongest automatic weapons in the game right now, giving you up to 23% enemy armor damage as a baseline. Additionally, as you might know, enemy armor damage and damage to elites also works on the sticky bomb and the seeker mine, and damage to elites also works with a turret, so if you have a skill-orientated build, then running with a lot of enemy armor damage and damage to elites in PvE is going to make a very big difference as well. Last up, I guess you could also say that the extra weapon damage on the gloves are also multiplicative. I know that saying that isn't 100% accurate, because the base damage that you see on the gloves gets added directly to the base damage on the weapons, but then the total number of that gets taken as a base to calculate everything on top of, so it pretty much works in the same way. It is just as good as any multiplicative bonus. And that's why I always stress so much that you need these weapon damage rolls on your gloves for your weapon archetype of choice. And those are pretty much all the multiplicative bonuses in the division. Now what can we take away from this? What can we take away from this video, apart from the fact that you should probably always try to land headshots and that crit builds are pretty strong? Because, yeah, we already knew that. Well, it tells us that, for instance, in PvE, it is 100% worth to actually run with purple gear mods that roll up to 4% damage to elites, even if you lose out on a few points of main stats because of it. It also tells us that weapon talents like Destructive, Ferocious, or Brutal are a lot stronger than they appear to be. You know, a lot of people nowadays glance over Brutal, but if you can consistently land headshots, it's actually a pretty powerful talent. It also tells us that for PvP, crit builds are probably the strongest ones out there, and having talents like Responsive, Distracted, and Prepared active, or having that 20% damage bonus from Banshee in the Dark Zone will absolutely make the difference between melting and getting melted by other players. I'm not joking, if you do the math, the difference can literally be up in the thousands of damage per bullet. And yeah, I think that's going to wrap it up for this video. I hope that this helped out some people with all of your builds and your potential future builds if you want to think about maximizing your damage. And for those that want to keep some sort of cheat sheet of what is additive and multiplicative, I'm going to leave you with a downloadable picture where you can find all the information. It's in the description, just save that to your computer. I promise, it's not a virus, it's just a useful thing, so you don't have to come back to this video to double check every single time. As always though, I will see you guys later, or like they say in the Netherlands, zie je later.